So this podcast is about voyages of exploration, okay? So you need to know about the explorers in the Elizabethan era and what it did for England and the wealth and power of the nation. Okay, so first of all, let's start off with Drake and his voyages of exploration. So Sir Francis Drake was an explorer, an adventurer and a military leader. The Golden Age is really called that because, yes, obviously Gloriana with Elizabeth I and how great her reign was and everything, but also because of everything that was explored during this period. So the circumnavigation of the world that Sir Francis Drake did in 1577 to 1580, so it took him 3 years to do it, is something that was absolutely groundbreaking, that somebody managed to go around the world. Now, Drake and his cousin John Hawkins made one of the first voyages to Africa to capture slaves. So this was known in those days, it's not really as the slave trade, but the human trade, but it is the start of the slave trade that you've obviously learnt about in terms of what you did in year 9 and when we've been doing about, America. Drake became something known as a privateer. Now what that was, it meant that it was an armed ship owner crewed by private individuals holding a commission from the Queen. So ultimately she knew that they were going to be, robbing things off Spanish ships and things like that, but it was sort of seen that these privateers were working on their own. But obviously Spain would see them as pirates. Now, all this exploration made Queen Elizabeth in England an absolute fortune, and it made these explorers extremely rich in things as well. And the Spanish nicknamed him the Dragon because he kept stealing from Spanish ships. So he kept stealing like silver and gold and things off Spanish ships. And he didn't really make any secret about this. And although Elizabeth knew this was happening, she just turned a blind eye to it. He was knighted in 1581, Sir Francis Drake. And in 1588, he'll be remembered for the successful defeat of the Spanish Armada because he led that. There was new technology that really helped them in terms of exploring. So there was the lateen sails, the triangular sails, which made the ships much more manoeuvrable. Also, they had improved defences and weapons on board the ships. And the astrolabe allowed sailors to find out where they were according to, astrology. And obviously there was also the development of better compasses as well. Now, the voyages remained, though, very, very dangerous. Drake set out with 5 ships and he actually only returned with 1 ship and only 58 men, and he'd obviously set off with 164. So it still was very dangerous, even though there was this new technology. So did the voyages then make England powerful? Well, that was the whole point of these voyages. There would have been no point doing them unless they were going to increase the power of England. So the actions of explorers increased the Queen's wealth and also the country's income. The real prize, though, was trade. So to begin with, their trade was just with Europe, with the people who were closer to them. But then the Far East became involved in our trading routes, and we got things like spices and silks and things, from the Far East. And direct routes to India really, really did raise profits in England. And also companies were established at this time, so things like the East India Trading Company, that obviously trading with India, and also the Muscovy Company. So we had a direct trading route with Moscow in Russia, so that obviously meant that we cut out all the middlemen and we could trade directly. And this set up routes for centuries to come. These lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. It wasn't just in Elizabethan times, it was also, a lot later than that as well. Now, there were spices, silks and porcelains that obviously brought in a lot of money that they got from, these eastern areas that they traded with. And in 1564, Hawkins kidnapped hundreds of West Africans, and this was the start of the human trade. And I don't like to say this, but actually this trade just grew and grew, and we were a massive part of that Britain, because obviously the slave trade was awful, really. But in terms of that, it was, something that made us very, very wealthy, and also the explorers wealthy that were involved in it. Hawkins was also responsible for building up the Royal Navy and was a respected military leader. He fought in the Spanish Armada, and he was also a privateer. So as I said before, that's somebody who's seen as working like individually and got a commission from the Queen, but actually the Queen absolutely knows what's going on. And he also introduced tobacco to England after discovering it during one of his voyages. So there's lots of things that are brought back to England, like indigenous people, potatoes, tobacco, all these things that are things that we've never seen before. And this is all from exploration. Now, you also need to know about Sir Walter Raleigh and stuff with the New World. So the voyages were about gaining wealth and influence, but also about gaining, more colonies. So basically colonies are where we take over other parts of the world and we own them. Okay, so we started to do that. You remember that we did that with the 13 states, you know, in America when we did, you know, the power and the people module. So we just took other people's land, basically. That's what started to happen. So European sailors crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, and Elizabeth gave Raleigh permission to explore, colonise and rule any land that was not already ruled by a Christian. In return, he had to give the Queen 1/5 of all the gold and silver he found there. Now Raleigh sent others to form some colonies first, you know, for the English, but it wasn't as easy as it sounded. The colony of Anouk was set up, but it didn't last, and the second colony in 1587 seemed set to succeed, but when the colony's leader returned after a trip to England, all of the people that he'd left there to colonise the area had disappeared, and actually it was a local tribe that had killed them. So although it sounded straightforward going just taking somebody else's land, it was actually quite difficult to colonise these areas. And the voyages of exploration were to increase the wealth, power and territory of England. So remember those three things: wealth, power and territory. That's why they did the explorations. And the wealth was things like, you know, raiding Spanish ships, the human trade, and obviously trade, you know, with goods and things as well, like with the East India Trading Company. The power came from us being a naval power and a growing force in terms of that. England also could exert its influence over many other, you know, weaker countries, because obviously, you know, we'd started to become richer through trade and through stealing off Spanish ships and things like that. And in territory, England failed in its first attempt to colonise America that I've just talked about, but other countries unfortunately beat England to that. But we persevered, and in the end it was the beginning of empire. Okay, so the empire that we ended up having, like the biggest empire in the world, and we still had that at the beginning of the 1900s, all of that started in this time period. So anything that you need to know about voyages of exploration or any of the explorers is on this podcast.